morning, you can have a seat. Welcome. Glad you are here. If we've not had a chance to meet, my name's Jason. I'm one of the pastors here at Hope, and we're just so glad that you've joined us this morning. And I've been dying to say this. I wasn't here last week, but I'm going to say it now. Merry Christmas, y'all. Glad you guys are here, man. This is I love this time of year. I love the lights. I love the sounds. I love the gingerbread lattes. I love all of it, okay? It's a good moment. Big thank you to Joel for last week coming in and teaching on hope and expectation. We are in the midst of, as we talked about earlier, celebrating Advent. And Advent is just a word that means arrival. Something has come, something is here. And this week, or last week, we looked at hope. This week, we're looking actually at preparation or getting ready. Now, a lot of what they call messianic prophecies, a lot of foretelling about this Messiah that was going to come appears in the book of Isaiah. We looked at one last week, and as we just read a few moments ago, Zach and his family read from Isaiah chapter 40. It happens again this week. And Isaiah can kind of be divided into two parts. The first part, chapters 1 through 39, is what they call pre-exile. See, what had happened was God had said, hey, look, guys, Israel, you're my people. I love you, but if you don't fix things, if you don't correct your behavior and change your heart, then what's going to happen is I'm going to send you on a very long journey. And that journey is going to lead you into foreign places where you don't want to go. It's going to be really hard for you, and you're going to basically be in bondage for a long time. Well, sure enough, Israel said, thanks, but we're good. Nothing changed. And God, true to his word, sent the Israelites into exile, and they were in exile for a very, very long time. And then you get to chapter 40 of Isaiah, which happens after, some scholars say, 60 years is the span of time between chapter 39 and chapter 40. And chapter 40 is kind of Israel going, whoa, we should have listened. God kind of knew what he was talking about, and now we're ready to start coming back into what our lives are supposed to be like. And we begin with Isaiah chapter 40, and we're going to read again what the Bible's read a minute ago in verse 3. And we're just going to see what God has to say to us this morning. It says, a voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley will be lifted up. Every mountain and hill will be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. This is the word of God. Isaiah 40 has become one of the most popular and probably famous passages with regards to Christmas. George Frederick Handel actually wrote a whole song in his work called Messiah on this. I'm not going to sing it for you. You're welcome, okay? It doesn't end well. But I would encourage you to go and pull it up. It's beautiful. It's really good. And it shows up actually later on in Matthew chapter 3 in the New Testament with a guy named John the Baptist who basically says, I'm the guy that's here to do this. This teaching is kind of becoming fulfilled in my presence with you. And he kind of had the same idea. And here it is, ready? It's two words. The whole passage can be boiled down to two words, and it's this: get ready. Every night, when my wife and I go to bed, we have a routine of sorts. For me, my routine is I make sure the kids are quiet and asleep. I get the coffee ready for the next morning. I check the locks. I put the dog in her crate. I cut off all the lights. I put on my PJs, wash my face, brush my teeth, take out my contacts, put on the fan in the bedroom, plug in my phone, get my alarm clock ready, crawl in the bed, read for 30 minutes, and then I go to sleep. My wife, after 15 years of marriage, I'm not exactly sure what she does. All I know is she beats me and she's passed out by the time I get to the bathroom. It's like lights out. We have vastly different approaches to getting ready for bed. And this is essentially what Isaiah is getting at. There's a lot of different ways that a lot of us are going to get ready. But he kind of boils it down to 4 specific distractions that we all face when it comes to being ready or getting ready to encounter or experience God. And these distractions are kind of like blinders for us. Things that if we just kind of go into autopilot, we are very sure to miss what God really wants to do in your life and in my life, especially in this season. And here they are. The first one is this: valleys. Isaiah says that in the midst of this, valleys are going to be raised. Now, there's a little bit of backstory here. In ancient Near Eastern culture, like what Isaiah was writing and with the Israelites, valleys were not a bad thing. You know, a lot of times when we think about valleys in the Bible, we immediately go to Psalm 23, right? The valley of the shadow of death, and that is a very real thing. But in the Near Eastern culture, valleys were actually a pretty good thing. It's where there were rivers, there were places of bounty, and there was a lot of plant life. I mean, it was just a really nice place to camp out. It was a really nice place to build a civilization. You had the mountains of protection all around you. Like, it was a really good spot. And in Isaiah's estimation, a valley represents the best of humanity and human productivity. And see, here's what had happened. Israel had become guilty of creating a system of religion that sought to control and compartmentalize God based on human effort. They were very efficient at everything that they did, including their spirituality. And what had happened was they failed to actually know God in the midst of this. God was possible as long as it fit within their system of belief, within their daily lives, and with the schedule that had already they'd laid out for themselves. They had forgotten the command of Deuteronomy 10:12, which says, "Now Israel, what does the Lord require of you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and love him, and to serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul." We all tend to have valleys. It's those places where we feel like we can manage God or fit him into our daily life. And all we have to do is show up, right? We show up on Sundays, all right? We spend 5-10 minutes in the morning. We read a daily scripture or prayer or whatever the case may be, and then we're out the door. The problem is this: when we reduce our spiritual journey and we compartmentalize it to various things and boxes we can check off, then we are in danger of building a house of cards that will eventually crumble and fall. This is the warning Jesus gives us in the New Testament, where he says, be careful to not build your house on the sand, but build it on the rock. Because when a storm comes, and y'all, storms come, if it's built on sand, it will fall apart. Richard Rohr, who's somebody I've quoted many times here, he has this amazing line, and honestly, the first time I read it, I didn't like it because it nailed me to the wall. Here's what he says: Christians are usually sincere and well-intentioned people until you get to any real issues of ego, control, power, money, pleasure, and security. Then they tend to be pretty much like everybody else. We often give a bogus version of the gospel, some fast food religion, without any deep transformation of the self. And the result has been the spiritual disaster of, quote, Christian countries that tend to be as consumer-oriented, proud, warlike, racist, class-conscious, and addictive as everybody else, and often more so, I'm afraid. I was talking to somebody this week, and I said, hey, if you could use one word to describe your spiritual journey, what would it be? And here's what he said: efficient. I thought that'd be very strange. I said, well, what do you mean by that? Like your relationship with God is efficient. He said, yeah, I wake up in the morning, I have my little daily time with Jesus. It's about 5-10 minutes while I drink my coffee. Then I get in the shower, I get ready for the day, I have my lunch, my breakfast, whatever, I say my prayer, and then I go to bed at night. That's the way I would describe my spiritual journey. And here's what I thought. I've been married 15 years, And my wife and I have recently started doing these things called date ins. On Thursdays, date night. The kids love date night because it usually means they get sent upstairs to watch something on Disney, and we just get some alone time. It's great. This past Thursday, we had date night over a plate of brisket nachos. And imagine I'm just sitting there looking at my sweet, amazing wife, and she would ask me, honey, how would you describe our marriage? How would it go if I looked at her and I said, it's efficient? Date over, right? Like, that's not the word you would use to describe your relationship with another human being. Yet so often, that's exactly the word that we would use to describe our relationship with God. It's efficient. It fits. Or maybe it doesn't fit. God is not interested in being fit into my already busy life. God is love, remember? And more oftentimes than not, love is not very efficient. The second distraction that we have, if it's not valleys, it's more oftentimes than not mountains. This is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. Right, you got valleys, human flourishing, productivity, efficiency, and on the other end, we've got the mountains. Throughout the Old Testament, if you kind of look at the pattern of where mountains appear in the scriptures, you discover that mountaintops are the places where God shows up. Right, think about Moses and the Ten Commandments. Right, he goes up this mountain, there's smoke and thunder and lightning and earthquakes, and God is there in the fire, and he hands Moses these 10 Commandments. Elijah on Mount Carmel, he prays a single prayer, and all of a sudden fire comes down from heaven, consumes everything, rocks included, right? Mountaintops are the place where God is found. Well, the ancient religious teachers thought, hey, if mountains are where God shows up, and we live in a country full of mountains, then every mountaintop can be a place where you can encounter God. So they built these houses of worship, these altars, these temples on top of these mountains. But the problem with that is that was completely contrary to what God had said. God said, hey, if you're going to worship me, it's going to be in Jerusalem at this one place. And Israel said, hey, we can actually expand his reach and do it everywhere else. And eventually this became symbolic of what was going to be required for you to worship God. All right, what you got to do is you got to get your sacrifice, and you got to get it up the mountain to God. And when he's up there, when you're up there, he's going to meet you, and it's going to be amazing. Well, the problem is most of the time, sacrifices were still living as you're going up the mountain. So you got to get your cow or your sheep or goat or whatever up the side of the mountain, or carry your crops up the top. It was a very arduous and often dangerous task. But the religious teacher says, well, if you're going to meet with God, it's got to be like this. These are the terms. Because if you don't, guess what? God's not going to show up. For Isaiah, and later for John the Baptist, the mountains represent the thought that keeping all of the religious laws would not be enough to meet with God. The religious teacher says, if you want to meet with God, if you want God's approval, you got to jump through these hoops. You got to do these things in this way, or God's not listening. And what Isaiah and later on John the Baptist said was, no, it doesn't work like that. Religious works do not equal righteous approval. Now, I know that you may be thinking, well, that's easy for me as a pastor, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but this morning I had an angel gently tap me on the shoulder. I levitated out of bed, and I was all good. No, it doesn't work like this. This morning, actually, I stumbled out of bed to cut my alarm clock off. I ran into the refrigerator on the way to the coffee pot. Like, that was kind of my morning this morning. Not very glamorous at all. But God, listen, God is no more impressed with your good than he is appalled by your bad. Why? Because that's not the way love works. Love simply is. It exists because the object of that love also exists. I've got a 4-year-old. You've probably already heard him. And every now and then, actually not every now and then, frequently throughout the day, here's what happens. I'll be in the kitchen or in the bedroom, and he'll be in the living room watching a show, reading a book, and all of a sudden, he just screams. I mean, at the top of his lungs, like one of those kind of cries, you're like, something's wrong. And so you run into the living room, and like, what's going on? Judah, like, what's up? And he goes, I love you. That's it. No crisis, like that was it. He just had to shriek it out. That's exactly the way that God longs to look at us. He just can't contain himself. God's deep love for you exists because you exist. It's as simple yet profound as that. The problem is that we often make it far more complicated when we feel like we have to add to it to make it more real, more lasting, or more present. The valleys are being raised. The mountains are being brought low. The third distraction is what he calls uneven ground. The word here for uneven in the Hebrew actually means hidden or deceitful. It's an agricultural phrase. I don't know how many of you grew up on a farm or around a farm, but the idea is that you're planting crops, but in order to plant crops, in order to put the seed in the ground, first you have to till up the soil. You got to get rid of the rocks. You got to pull out the trees and the roots. You got to level the ground out, because if you don't, inevitably what's going to happen is as your oxen or horses or whatever are plowing the ground, they're going to step in a hole, break a leg, and then you lose your workforce. You've got to make the ground even. For so many of us, myself included, there are hidden places in our lives that we'd like to keep hidden because of the fear of what would happen if they were exposed. It may be a sin habit. It may be an addiction. It may be just failed relationships, poor decisions. It may be the image that you have in your mind of what your body looks like. It could be your relationship with food. It could be your mental health. But it's that area that you're like, nobody can know this about me. Because if they know this about me, then I will continue to be alone and isolated and removed from everybody around me. It's the things that you intentionally don't tell other people when you walk into a job interview. Think about it like this. Fill in the blank here. I hope nobody asks me about blank. Another way of saying this, man, I really hope nobody finds out about whatever that is. That's your uneven ground. That's the place that God longs to smooth out and uncover and actually plant something really rich and beautiful for growth. But so often we just want to ignore it because we're embarrassed by it. We're hurt by it. We're frustrated by it. The fourth place of distraction is what he calls rough places. I love this word. It's a Hebrew word, rekashim. Just sounds good. Rekashim. But here's what rekashim means. Impassable. This is a phrase used so many times by people who are going on a long journey. When you're traveling, as they did in the ancient world, with basically a horse and a cart, or many times on foot, you had to plan your route very carefully because there were certain obstacles or dangers that were going to be in your way. And if you got to those and you didn't have a plan for how you were going to get around them or through them, it was basically death. So they plan these journeys sometimes hundreds of miles out of the way to avoid those impassable places, those rekashim places. I'm a little bit of a Lord of the Rings nerd. Okay, I love the movie. I love the books. And there's a scene in the first movie, if you've seen it, where Frodo Baggins, who is on a mission to destroy this ring in the fires of Mount Doom, he's traveling with his companions, and they get to this place, and there's this huge mountain, and they're like, all right, we got to go over it. They start climbing. Things start out okay. But then at some point, the weather gets so bad, the blizzard gets so awful, and their enemy starts shouting down things at them, and boulders are falling. It's just terrible. They go, we got to go back. We got to go back. My question for you this morning is this. What is your impassable place in your life? Think about it like this. Sometimes they appear as doubts. We often call this around here the dark night of the soul or the wall. It's that place you get to spiritually and you're like, I was doing good until COVID. Until that relationship fell through. I was fine. And now I don't know. Maybe it's your frustrations. Maybe it's your disappointments. Maybe it's just spiritual apathy. I think sometimes we think God's going to show up in this moment. God's going to show up in this circumstance. God's going to come through. And then he doesn't. At least not the way that we think. And we're left at a place of rekashim. It feels impassable. Full transparency, this has been hard for me this year. This is where I've been a lot of the year. I felt like, God, you're going to show up here and it's going to be this thing. And it was silence. And that silence became weighty. And it felt like an impassable place. So what do you do when you're in those impassable moments where you expect God to meet you and instead it's quiet? The temptation, if you're like me, is to try harder. I'm going to do more. I'm going to get busier. I'm going to be more accomplished. I'm going to read more. I'm going to pray harder. I'm going to be busy for Jesus. Or sometimes just simply ignore it and think, well, I'll just shut it out. But if we look back at Isaiah, what we discover is that's actually not the invitation that's there. It's an invitation for something much deeper. John, later on, quoting Isaiah, says that it's an invitation to join him on the highway in the desert. Now, there's not a lot happening here in the text when it comes to the word desert. Desert is exactly what it sounds like. When we think about a desert, I don't know if you've ever been to a desert, but I mean, just think about things like the Sahara or a lot of Midwestern to Western America. It's just a lot of nothing. It's a place where nothing happens, or to quote the brilliant Dr. Seuss, the waiting place. It's a place of loneliness, a place of solitude. It's a place where, honestly, we least want to be. But the word that's used here by Isaiah and John the Baptist is a word actually we've used before here at Hope. When talking about silence and solitude, it's the word eremos. It's an invitation to solitude. It's a place where Moses and the Israelites wandered for 40 years until getting to the promised land. It was a place of exposure, a place of dependence, a place of stripping away everything that doesn't belong. And it was the place where Jesus regularly went to meet with God. And in the teaching of Jesus, he says, it is the way to God. Let's look at this one more time, because there's something I want to show you about this. Isaiah chapter 40, starting in verse 4 this time. Isaiah says, every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And then circle this word in your text. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Did you notice what Isaiah says about when God is going to show up? It's after those four things have been dealt with, after the mountains are brought down, the valleys are raised up, after the uneven ground is smoothed and the rough places are made into a plain, then the glory of the Lord shows up. That phrase, glory of the Lord, simply means the presence of God. The presence of God. Another way of saying is this: without the preparation of these four areas in our lives, we will never see or experience the presence of God in our lives. But notice where this happens. It doesn't happen on the mountain. It doesn't happen in the valley. It happens in the desert. It happens in the eremos, in the wilderness. So what happens then if we don't accept this invitation to go out into this place? What happens if we don't accept it? And listen, this is not a threat. Right? This is not a, well, if you don't accept this, then you're going to get a flat tire on your way to work tomorrow morning. Right? That's not what's happening here. But here's what will happen. You will remain restless. You will become more isolated. You will eventually shrink into a smaller, more hardened version of what you could be. And you will miss out on something bigger, greater, and more incredible than the life you are currently living. Now, how in the world is that a Christmas message? Here's how. If our version of Christmas and Christianity consists of nothing more than a sweet, little blonde-haired, blue-eyed Caucasian baby neatly wrapped in a white blanket, nestled among some sweet farm animals next to a picture of Santa Claus kneeling at the foot of a wooden box, and fits nicely and neatly into our lives of Christmas shopping and Hallmark movies, then we have grossly misunderstood Christmas and Christianity as a whole. Christmas is an invitation into the wilderness, into the eremos, a place of preparation and encounter where you are not abandoned. In fact, it is in the wilderness that you can finally experience God having been stripped of all of the faulty pretenses and unmet expectations and disappointments, and we are able to meet with God face to face. It's an invitation to experience the healing presence of God and understand, as Henry Nouwen says, that the salvation of the world and of your own soul is God's work, not ours. And here's the brilliance. Here's the amazing part of this whole journey. When we start on this journey and we level out those places in our lives and we remove those distractions, we discover that we are not on our way to find God, but we are actually already in God's presence. It's an invitation to find the way. And do you remember what Jesus says in John 14? One of his disciples said, how are we going to know the way? And Jesus says, I am the way. When we accept this invitation and we become apprentices of Jesus, it's an invitation to finally see ourselves as objects of God's affection, objects of God's love, objects of God's adoration, stripped of all those distractions, stripped of all the external stuff. Let me ask you this. How was your 2020? Maybe for some of you, it was a banner year. Right? I mean, maybe you got a new job, new car, new relationship, like whatever. Like you owned it and it was amazing. I read a story of a guy a few weeks ago who, I think it was in Indonesia, and he was just sitting in his house one day and all of a sudden he heard this loud crash come from the front of his house, and he ran out there and discovered this huge hole in his living room. And inside of his living room on the floor was a meteorite. And he was like, that's kind of odd. So he took it and had it examined by some scientists or researchers. Come to find out the thing was worth $2 million. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear things crashing, most of the time it's not a $2 million rock. It may be junk. That guy is probably the only guy who had an amazing 2020. Chances are, for a lot of us, 2020 was the opposite of that. It was a year of impassable and unstable ground. You found yourself staring at your bank account going, I don't know how we're going to make this work. Your job situation is less than ideal. You feel like you're utterly robbed of the joy of going into work. You're exhausted. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe it was a year of relationship change, and the stability that you thought you had in one relationship turned out to be fake or faulty or non-existent. Maybe it was a year where your health took a nosedive. And 2021 is looking like it's going to be a year of x-rays, doctor's visits, scans. Christmas, the Advent season, is an opportunity to prepare to encounter God. But here's the catch. We have to slow down. We have to embrace what Dallas Willard calls the ruthless elimination of hurry in our overly busy and distracted lives, and accept the invitation to journey into the eremos, into the wilderness. And it's there that we discover that Advent has already happened, that the arrival is complete, and God is with us.